I'm Dr. Karl, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and traditional custodians of the lands where we live, learn and work. G'day, Dr. Karl here, Shirtless of Science, University of Sydney. Very happy to be interviewing Royce Kurmelovs with your fabulous book, Slick, Australia's Toxic Relationship with Big Oil. Have I got the name and your pronunciation correctly?
Pitch perfect, first time. Well done.
This is a book about climate change, big oil, and it's kind of a work of a new style of journalism I'd never heard of. It's called climate accountability journalism. Can you just give us a bit of 101 for somebody like me who's never heard of this concept?
Yeah, so look, the book itself is written more as a narrative rather than kind of a very dense treatise on kind of this issue, and that's to make it more accessible. And part of this is written in mind with something that has been pioneered by Amy Westervelt. She runs Drilled, the climate change podcast, one of the biggest in the world. And she started that where she had this idea or this realization around the time when you had a bunch of true crime podcasts becoming a big deal. And she was like, well, you've got climate change, which is one of the biggest kind of true conspiracies going, and you got true crime becoming big. So let's marry the two together to make it kind of interesting and relevant to the average person. Prior to that, her role as a journalist has been involved in this idea of climate accountability journalism, which is journalism that goes back and investigates the historical and current role of fossil fuel producers, governments, public relations firms, different actors in the economy and life, and their role in helping to either conceal the reality of climate change, disrupt efforts to do anything about it, to delay efforts to do stuff about it, and pull out who is doing what to understand how we got to this point.
So your book deals with a few different periods. So you got the early period, the middle period, the high period, and the late period. So what time period are we talking from the whole beginning of your book to the end? From what year to what year, roughly?
Most people who listen to this, and I think you yourself are aware of this kind of idea that Exxon knew about climate change. Oil companies were involved in this campaign at some point to kind of muddy the waters around the science. But when that conversation is had, particularly here in Australia, it focuses on North America and Europe, and it doesn't really pay attention to kind of where we sat in that mix. And so part of my project was to go and look, okay, well, what does that mean Exxon knew? And also, where were the Australians in this? What were we doing in this process? How do we fit into this global story about this campaign to derail the science of climate change? And so for me, I began with the creation of the Australian oil industry in Australia, how it arrived here, the first find of oil, and then how almost immediately the industry then began to organize politically to kind of bend the rules, so to speak, or to lobby to get things more in their favor. And this was partly because a lot of my work historically and previously has been on social movements and this idea of how to, of people organizing to achieve a particular outcome. And so I began to increasingly look at these companies as if they were activists, as if they were social movements to better understand their role in this overall process.
When did oil begin in the USA and when did it begin in Australia?
When we talk about the history of oil, usually we locate it in kind of the US and Pennsylvania, I believe, with one of the first successful drill sites there. But actually, the historical production of oil began in Burma. You had these families in Burma who became known as Burma under kind of British colonial rule. You had these families that were extracting this stuff and then using it for various purposes. And then the first export of oil took place from British colony there for use in India. The same thing happened with Australian coal, for instance. We had, I believe that the first Australian coal was identified by an escaped convict who stumbled across coal at Newcastle, came back, told everyone about it, and then the first exports went to India as well. But usually the modern history of oil begins in the US, begins as kind of like a side project, and it gradually builds up over time. But where it really begins to kind of become significant is when Winston Churchill converts the British naval fleet from running on coal to running on oil.
Wow, when was that?
The turn of last century. So there was a big Royal Commission into how to power the British naval fleet, how to maintain that naval dominance. And the solution was, well, oil was much more useful as a fuel. At that point, you see the interests of the oil industry get married up with the interests of, national security and in that moment, empire. And then it becomes central to kind of how people are looking at the globe as a complete realignment of how people look at the globe takes place. So at that point, for the next 50 years, what you get is the global oil industry really becomes the US oil industry, the UK oil industry, and the European oil companies who make up the dominant part of this producer group.
So it begins, say, 1900 with the British Navy saying we're going to go oil for our ships. And when did the discovery of oil start happening in Australia?
It's actually a fascinating story because we were late to the party. People found blotches of oil or gas in kind of various wells that they dug around the country, but nothing that they thought could substantiate like a big oil exploration program. In fact, the geological theory at the time for a good part of Australian history was that Australia was too old for oil. It was an old continent where all the geological formations that would hold this stuff had been eroded away over time, and you just weren't going to find any here. And that gets overturned in 1953 at a place called Rough Range 1 in Western Australia.
1953.
1953.
Wow,
so
that's when it begins.
The first find takes place, and at that point, everything kind of kicks off. You have William Walkley turns up for Ampol. You have the guy that helps the tobacco industry learn to muddy the waters around the link between smoking and tobacco is on site for that as well. Everyone's there at this moment. But, and this is the fun part of the story, it still takes the Australian oil industry another 10 years before it can get off the ground. They couldn't find a large enough supply to justify their existence economically.
Right. Okay, so just a bit of a background for the audience. We should thank the oil industry because we've got whales today. And if we didn't have the oil industry, whales would have been completely wiped out for their oils, both for lubrication and for fuel.
I'm a little bit cautious about framing it so clearly, but in principle, yes, the transition from whale oil into fuel oil was significant part of industrialization and also saved, whales as a species. But I think what that speaks to is the level of extraction involved, like in both these industries. At first, there was a process of extraction around whales as an animal, as you say, nearly drove them to extinction. And then we have a similar sort of way of thinking about how we extract oil and then gas from the ground and then bring it to market with the resulting effects on climate change.
So just to give a bit of a background history, which unfortunately I'm going to quote my little book of climate change science for a moment. So it's called Dr. Karl's little book of climate change science. But Fourier started wondering, a French theoretician, about how come the Earth and the Moon are the same distance from the sun, but the Earth is a lot warmer, and he put it down to atmosphere. Then in the mid-1800s, we've got various scientists in the United States and the United Kingdom showing that carbon dioxide acted like a one-way valve and would let heat in but not out. Around the 1930s, Guy Callender was measuring and saying, look, there's something going on. We're still not sure yet. At the end of the 60s, you get somebody measuring carbon dioxide levels on Mauna Kea. And in 1973, you get Munich Re, the world's largest reinsurance company, saying it's happening, because we've got 4 centuries of insurance records here in Europe, and we're seeing extreme events, and we're sure they're caused by a thing called the greenhouse effect, and we're going to start charging money. A few years later, James Black, the chief scientist for Exxon, 1977, says it's definitely going on. We've got to start doing some research. And from 1977 to 1990, the fossil fuel companies did the best research in the world on climate change. And by 1982, they were convinced that it was real. And they did, to their credit, some minor things to reduce carbon dioxide in the atmosphere while getting an overview. In 1990, 2 things happened. 1990, all the scientists said it is real. Climate change is real. And the same year, the fossil fuel companies started denying it. It was a budget of up to $1 billion a year. And here we are a third of a century later. They definitely knew that it was happening. And since 1990, when they started denying it, half of the carbon dioxide that has been added to the atmosphere has been added. They added it while they knew what was going on. And you mentioned the oil companies getting friendly with various governments. I do believe that in the calendar year of 2021, the 24 fossil fuel companies in Australia, out of a total revenue, in other words, taking stuff out of the ground, oil, gas, coal, etc., revenue of 1/10 of Australia's GDP, $150 billion. And on that, they paid tax in the year 2021 of not 30 billion, $30, which is enough to buy 6 or 7 cups of coffee for all of Australia's 20 million or so citizens, which I worked out to be roughly 0.000042 of a mil, which I talked with my chemistry colleagues. That tiny droplet of coffee spread among all of Australians was not enough to see with the naked eye. And your book then goes into the whole climate accountability, going through the early period, the middle period, the high period, and the late period.
For a start, that is an incredible explanation of the timeline, and that is such a very good speed run for anyone who hasn't caught up with it. There are a few additional dates to add to that, though. You're right that you had James Black and the Exxon scientists in the late 70s kind of engaged in a very good research program on this issue and informing the company. But actually, the industry began work on this much sooner than that. So you have the very first studies that start to investigate the greenhouse effect and kind of what does this thing kind of crop up in the early 50s. This is a really important part of the story because there were two things that happened. On the one hand, you had a scientist in Los Angeles trying to understand why this smog above Los Angeles was so bad. Eventually, he did the research and he identified that it was all the cars on the road that was causing this smog, to the extent that people had to wear gas masks on the street to move between buildings sometimes.
And your description of that is just gorgeous in your fine book, which you should mention again, Slick, Australia's toxic relationship with big oil. That bit was just lovely.
So what you have is the American automotive industry comes after that scientist in the same way oil companies would come after climate scientists later. But then the next thing that happens is the tobacco industry. Scientists swab the back of mice with cigarette tar and it begins to grow a tumor. So then the tobacco companies start realizing that they're about to be sued and they're about to face like serious litigation. As all this was going on, the oil industry was sitting in the middle as people connected to both these similar industries, kind of looking at both these eventualities and said, right, we can put two and two together here. If people are getting mad about this smog because of the burning of fossil fuels and people are suing the tobacco companies, eventually people are going to realize that we are providing the fuel that causes these problems, like the greenhouse effect, and they're going to come for us. So we better understand this. We better get across this. We better start investigating this. And then you have the American Petroleum Institute come up with the first investigations, start outsourcing, getting labs in. And then you have the Stanford Research Institute puts together a report, I believe, in 1968. Conclusions of the two researchers who worked on that were incredible. They were very clear. They clearly linked the burning of fossil fuels to climate change. And they said that this is basically a grand experiment with our climatic systems. The American oil industry at the time responded by saying, thanks, guys, love your work. Could you do a second report and just tone it down a little bit, and then you can release that to the public and we'll keep this to ourselves? That was kind of the point at which industry programs kicked off and keeping this trending in the background. What's fascinating is that when we come to Australia around this time, Australia started to get similar warnings. So we had the 1969 Senate Committee into Air Pollution doing the rounds and releasing its report. And the opening paragraph of this document, which is from government, a branch of the Australian government, was clear that carbon dioxide is a problem. And it explained that humanity was treating the atmosphere like a garbage dump.
A free garbage dump.
Putting this waste into the atmosphere. And this is something that we need to pay attention to. And then it never says it again. It never mentions anything about this for the rest of the report. But when you go back and look at the evidence, the person who was responsible for raising the alarm about that was one very brave, one very conscientious Tasmanian chemist, Professor Harry Bloom, gives evidence at the Senate committee hearing and gets described as an address because it's so emotional and so impactful when he's kind of calling this out. And he says, I've seen some studies. They're very reliable. He is certain that this is happening, that this is real, even in spite of some of the pushback from some of the senators. So that's kind of the first government warning. And then you start to see other things tick over. For instance, the person who formed the lobby group that represented the Australian oil industry, the oldest and biggest one in the country, was a geologist. And he was a geologist that helped found Santos. He founded Beach Energy, and he was the founding chair of the Australian Petroleum Exploration Association. And in 1969, he writes for a government journal talking about marine issues, that sea level rise is a threat to the Australian coastline, and that's something we've got to keep an eye on. So he was aware as early as that. He was paying attention to this issue at that point.
1969 and Reg Sprigg.
You also have the birth of the environment movement. You have people saying, hey, let's not drill for oil on the Great Barrier Reef. Hey, let's protect our rainforests. And this scares the industry. And so they begin to organize to try and tell everyone that it's all right. Tell everyone that the issue is in hand, that we've got this. Do you have to worry about it? We will solve this with our expertise, with our skills, our engineering know-how. We will get a handle on this. That's where the issue kind of enters into the Australian public discussion.
It's really climate accountability journalism, where you go through year by year pointing out how the fossil fuel industry has been telling us lies.
Well, it's to understand in first principles what happened and to have a proper accounting of events. And to be clear, I'm not a lawyer. I speak to lawyers in the book. I talk about kind of the legal significance of this stuff, to awareness that this may come to something in the future. But in the first principle, it's first off to get a proper accounting of events. Who did what, when, what do people know, and what do they do with that information? And as you say, you get to a point in the timeline, around 1984, it seems to pivot. Exxon comes clean to the global oil industry about the research it was doing from James Black and others. Yeah. It informs them what's going on. And then they set to work. And then in 1999, as you said, things kick off, and the campaign comes underway, and you start to see the efforts to undermine that science. And at that point, you start to get the disinformation campaign, you start to get the misinformation, you start to get the attempt. There were variations of it. Some was outright denial. Some was to say this isn't happening or we're not responsible. Others was to say, yeah, this is happening, but the question is how we deal with this, and it was to quibble with the practicalities and to debate that rather than the issue, because that was where they could kind of stall for time. And what was incredible is in going back and looking at some of these materials, I found a document from 1996 from Australia's biggest oil and gas industry association, where he was a new CEO, he was very, cocky, and he publishes a briefing where he says explicitly that the goal for any climate action ahead of Kyoto was to stall for time. Because what these companies wanted to do was they were aware this was coming, and they said that what should happen was we should take as long as possible to do the transition, because we want to run down our aging refineries, all our gas processing hubs. We want to run that into the ground, take as much money as we can from it, then you can do what you like with it. So you should give us as much time as possible to make this happen, because the science is uncertain. And he says that explicitly in that document.
And when they talk about money, when the head of Exxon resigned, he took with him a small bonus of $0.4 billion.
Nice work if you can get it.
Yeah. The subsidies enjoyed by the fossil fuel companies are 7% of the world GDP. So out of every dollar that is earned, 7 cents goes directly or indirectly to the fossil fuel companies on top of the profits that they're making. One thing that I found really interesting in your book,
Slick, Australia's toxic relationship with big oil.
Okay, and before we dive into it, let me mention also a book by Naomi Oreskes called Merchants of Doubt. Besides buying your fine book, they should read this book, because she details exactly how they told lies following the example of the tobacco industry. But getting back to you in your fine book, there's a chapter where you talk about the oil industry had an organised program to spread lies into schools.
In a manner of speaking, and just to go back as well, we should be very clear that when we talk about Naomi Oreskes' work and the idea that the big oil borrows from the big tobacco playbook, it's actually the reverse. The oil industry taught the tobacco industry how it was done. And which goes to our point, which is when we talk about influence, when we talk about lobbying, it wasn't just knocking on doors of politicians. There was a real concerted effort to shape the way people think about this issue, so they could not imagine a world without oil, gas, or coal. It was much more subtle, much softer, and one of the ways that they sought to do this was through schools. And throughout most of Australian history, there have been kind of individual companies who have varying levels of loyalty to their community. So they would bring kids out to look at a refinery so they can see how it works, and maybe one day they'll work in that refinery. But there was never anything coordinated until the 90s. And in the 90s, what happens is they get this teacher in who was a former science teacher at Victorian Public Schools. She's doing a master's program, and she's on a kind of industry experience thing where she's working for them. And one of the things they get her to do is design them a program how they can better get into schools. And then she presents this to the National Oil and Gas Industry Conference with this document that says, this is an explicit part of the industry's public relations activities. They want to get into schools to ensure kids are familiar with them, that they're not scared of them, and that they see that the oil industry is a potential future for them to work for, potentially invest in, and to interact with as good corporate citizens. And you can still go to libraries and find these materials around. For instance, I found a photo of the big book of oil and gas at its launch, where you had Tony Abbott reading it to a group of school kids in Canberra. He was looking very confused by the subject matter, I have to say, and the kids were looking very bored. This program continued for several years, but then a very interesting thing happened was with the creation of the internet. The second the internet gets made, you see the oil industry leap on this as another potential avenue for spreading this information. What happens is that the old program relying on producing books and pamphlets and school kits fades, and instead they pick up this idea of we can create programs on CD-ROMs and distribute that to schools.
Wow.
And they were on this technology to begin with, and that program continues today, not in the same form. It's largely been decentralized. But what's happened is that now you have individual websites from these organizations that allow teachers to go on and download school materials anonymously. And so if there's a teacher who maybe is not particularly interested in geological sciences or the earth sciences, and they want to find material, they can go onto this website and download it. Except that, when you look closely at some of what these materials say, particularly about climate change or the greenhouse effect, very thin, very outdated, and it suggests that we should be thankful for greenhouse gases, which is a problem if that is what people are using by default.
Now, you mentioned a very clever phrase there, embedded. So fossil fuel companies have gone to a great deal of trouble to have themselves embedded in every aspect of our society, so we can't imagine a world without them. But we use fossil fuels for two things, energy and raw materials. Energy, all the energy that we get from fossil fuels, we can replace that with energy from renewables. And there's absolutely zero doubt about that. Read The New Climate War by Michael Mann, The New Climate War by Michael Mann. All the energy that we get from fossil fuels can be replaced by other sources of energy. And secondly, the raw materials. The fossil fuel companies supply the feedstock for plastics, and that's a huge income for them. And it's in their interest to not recycle plastics. And so recycling of plastics is down to about 10% instead of 99%. And as a result, we've invented the word plasticenta. In 2021, we started finding microplastics in placentas of women being born, and now we've found it in testes, in sperm, in every drop of rain that falls out of the sky, the top of Mount Everest, the bottom of the Marianas Trench. And I'm sorry to say, in terms of adults like you and me, 7 grams in our brains. 1/2 of our brain is made up of microplastics. We can replace those raw materials with other things. So, for example, I do love the cling wrap that you put on the food from the supermarket to home because it reduces wastage. I don't like that it's made from stuff that won't break down. You can make it from soybean waste. And with wood, as an example of getting new raw materials, with wood you can treat it one way so that it's 3 times harder than steel. You can treat it another way so it's as transparent as glass. And so the bottom line is, the solution to climate change is really easy. We just simply leave every atom of carbon that's in the ground, leave it there. Just do not take any more out. Just stop. That unfortunately means that the oil industry is going to lose out, as once in the past the sail industry lost out when steam engines came in.
For me, the most mind-blowing fact in doing this research was learning how the oil companies, when they were helping out their friends in tobacco by lending their labs and lending their scientists to help head off this litigation, they also took out patents for cigarette filters because it was the same scientists working for both companies that were helping develop these things as a means to head off regulation. So the most ubiquitous symbol for pollution that we have, the cigarette butt, has also in many cases been patented by large fossil fuel producers because they helped develop them in the first place.
And it appears that they're so impervious to the ravages of times that the cigarette butt filters will outlast the pyramids. Oh my God.
And the question is whether, how long the oil industry will last at this point. I mean, we already know, I think 1991, the International Energy Agency released its report in 2021 that said that there can be no new oil, gas, and coal investment from the end of that year if we hope to reach net zero, because the world largely has enough oil, gas, and coal reserves it needs to make that transition at that point. The fossil fuel industry reacted predictably to this as if it was a bombshell and have largely refused it. And since then, that has started a global conversation about this idea of a managed fossil fuel phase out, which was kind of the subject of what happened at COP28 in Dubai last year. Whether or not that will be maintained is the question. And again, that's up to kind of everyone listening in terms of how they want to think and act.
As we come to the end, the thing is that people should buy your fine book to get a really detailed climate accountability journalism of just seeing the facts laid out quite clearly of who did what, with whom, to whom, and when. And so the name of your book, Australia's Toxic Relationship with Big Oil, slick at the front, and the big picture, we can run our society perfectly well and leave every atom of carbon that's underground, leave it there. How can people follow you in your fine work, and what's your next project now?
A lot of what I relied on was industry documents itself for this, and you can go read them at slickthebook.com.au. You can find the references and have a look at them. You can find my website if you want to get in touch at roycekurmelovs.com. You can also follow me on Blue Sky, where I've made the transition from the website formerly known as Twitter. Those are the best places. If you want to get a book, you can pick one up wherever books are sold.
So Royce is as in Rolls-Royce, R-O-Y-C-E.
R-O-Y-C-E.
And how do you spell Kurmelovs?
Kurmelovs. I'm pretty sure I'm the only one on the planet, so if you Google me, I come up.
Look, thank you so much for your terrific account of who did what, when, and underlying it, the complete immorality and their only goal being economic self-interest. Is that possible?
Yes, in a nutshell.
Wow. Okay. Well, look, thank you very much for coming online, and thank you very much for having done this fine book, Dr. Royce.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Shirtloads of Science is washed, spun and aired by the University of Sydney.